Oftentimes when tenants are looking for space, they will find either raw space, shell and core space, or they will find space that has already had a prior tenant in it. A discerning prospective tenant will look at the space and decide, can some of this be reutilized? Are the phone systems still fundamentally pretty good? Is there wire and cabling that's still good? Is there teldata systems that can be used? And so on. In biotech, are there laboratory facilities, lab benches, that can be either reconditioned or used? So to the extent that at the beginning, a tenant looks around and keeps its mind open for not only raw space that they would have to pay a premium to build up from just shell and core, to space that they're only reconverting, it can be a cost savings up front. And again, if there's a design and development plan informed by professionals that you would bring in, space planners and designers, it may be that, well, why don't you start in this space, and 5 years from now, when things go as well as we all plan that they're going to go, we can reconfigure the space and in effect upgrade you in the same location. So those are important considerations when you're going into negotiations, and those are negotiable. Quite frequently, landlords will give tenants a tenant improvement allowance, which is a certain amount of money for the tenant to spend on design and construction of their space. The longer the term of the lease, usually the higher the tenant improvement allowance. Tenants should be aware that the landlord is giving them a head start. They just need to be smart about how they're spending that money. At the beginning of every lease, a tenant needs to have an identity of who they are now, but who they might be later. And when you're designing space, when you're even deciding how much space you need, you have to keep that identity clearly in mind. Oftentimes, you can negotiate with a landlord to take a certain fixed amount of space, and then also negotiate rights to take additional space if and when that space comes up in the building. No startup, no tenant wants to be in a situation where their operations are scattered. They want things under one roof, under one umbrella, where they can be protective and where they can operate at peak efficiency, and where they can maximize their ability to collaborate on what their operations and their various departments are doing. But you may not have those departments set up yet. Your marketing department might be 2 people today. Hopefully it's going to be 20 people 5 years from now. Where are you going to put the other 18 people? Things like ROFO rights, which are right of first offer rights, are one way that a tenant can try to plan for success down the road in the future if and when space becomes available. ROFO simply means that if space becomes available, the landlord will offer it to the tenant first whenever it becomes available. So you can see how a startup's changing financial position 2 years from now might say, hey, we should grab space if we can get it, or it might say we need to pass on space if we can get it. So being cognizant of things like ROFO rights and expansion rights and negotiating for those is a very smart move and a very forward-looking move for a tenant. The tenant's responsibilities up front really are to build the space to their own particular needs. And that's where tenants can get caught up sometimes in the fantasy of what they need and in the reality of what they need. Frequently, space will be delivered by the landlord in an as-is condition. Sometimes it's just shell and core. Sometimes it's space that can be reconverted. Depends on the nature of the physical space we're talking about. But then it's up to the tenant to determine what they need to do as part of what's known as tenants improvements in order to improve the space. And again, a tenant can do that in a sequential and a phased manner that can lessen the cost up front and then still allow the tenant to keep on improving and further improving their own physical plant and their own physical facilities. So one conference room might make sense now, but keeping an eye on the fact that you may want to convert another part of your space into a conference room later will tell you, well, do we want to keep them separate or do we want to keep them proximate? What works for us? Those types of considerations require some forward looking by tenants, but to the extent that you can plan that in and look into the future and then bring it back to the present in your negotiations with the landlord, you're in a much stronger position as a tenant as you go down the road.